Picture this, spring 1962. A quiet kitchen where Dorothy Aldrich pours coffee for her husband, smiles at her kids, but hides a secret no one suspects. She never complained about money struggles, never asked for help, yet behind the bread box sat an envelope that would change everything. This is part 1 of our 5-part cinematic series, She Never Said They Were Struggling, But She Had a Plan. Discover how one woman's invisible strategy beat every crisis. If you want timeless lessons for your own life and to follow Dorothy's full journey, subscribe now and hit the bell. Part 2 drops soon. There's a moment, right before a household wakes up, when the truth lives out in the open. Before the coffee percolates, before the children's feet hit the floor, before a husband buttons his collar and reaches for his hat. In that narrow window of silence, you can sometimes see a woman for who she really is, not the version she shows the world, but the one doing all the quiet, invisible work beneath it. Dorothy Aldrich was 31 years old in the spring of 1962. She had a husband named Earl, who drove a delivery truck for a wholesale grocer, 2 children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 5, and a house with a leaking downspout that Earl had been meaning to fix since November. She also had a secret. Not the kind that destroys families, not the kind whispered about on front porches. Hers was quieter than that, and far more powerful. It lived in an ordinary brown envelope tucked behind the bread box in her pantry, and in a ledger no wider than a paperback novel that she kept beneath a stack of dish towels in the second drawer to the right of the sink. Nobody asked about the ledger. Nobody thought to. To everyone who knew her, to Margaret next door, to the women at the church social, to Earl himself, Dorothy was simply a good homemaker, capable, steady, the kind of woman who always seemed to have enough. But enough doesn't arrive on its own. It doesn't fall from the sky or appear on a doorstep wrapped in luck. It is constructed, quietly and carefully, by women who understand something most people never figure out, that the distance between stability and chaos is almost always thinner than it looks, and that the only thing standing in that gap is a plan. Dorothy had a plan. She'd had one since the week after their wedding, when she added up Earl's first take-home pay, subtracted rent, utilities, and groceries, and stared at what was left with the expression of someone doing math they already know they don't like. She didn't panic, she didn't cry, she reached for a pencil. That pencil, and the discipline behind it, would carry her family through a decade of tight winters, broken appliances, unexpected doctor visits, and the slow creep of a consumer culture that seemed to be determined to convince every American woman that she needed more than she had. Dorothy never believed it. This is her story. Earl Aldrich was not a careless man. He handed over his paycheck every 2 weeks without complaint, trusted Dorothy entirely with the household accounts, and never once asked to see the ledger. Not because he was indifferent, but because in 1962, in houses like theirs, that was simply how it worked. She managed the money, he earned it. What Earl didn't know, what he had no reason to suspect, was that Dorothy had divided his paycheck into 6 separate allocations before he'd even set his hat on the hook by the door. Rent, utilities, food, clothing, medical, and the last one, the one she never named out loud, reserve. The reserve wasn't savings in any official sense. There was no bank account attached to it, no passbook, no interest. It was cash, folded, organized, and tucked into that brown envelope behind the bread box, with the quiet resolve of a woman who had seen what happened when families didn't have one. Her own mother had gone 3 days without groceries after her father lost a week of work to a knee injury in 1941. Dorothy had been 10 years old. She never forgot the particular silence of a pantry that's almost empty, the way you open it hoping it'll somehow look different than it did an hour ago. She had promised herself on her wedding night that her children would never know that silence. The reserve grew slowly. Some weeks it was 50 cents, some weeks nothing at all, but it grew, because Dorothy treated it the same way she treated the rent, non-negotiable, first priority, not available for discussion or impulse. Earl ate his eggs that morning and folded his newspaper and said, "I think we're doing all right, Dot." She smiled and refilled his coffee. She didn't tell him about the water heater estimate she'd gotten on Tuesday, $42 for parts and labor. She didn't tell him because she already knew she could cover it. She'd been building toward exactly this kind of moment for 2 years. "We're doing fine," she said. And they were, because she'd made sure of it. Margaret Holt was everything Dorothy was not, and Dorothy liked her for it. Where Dorothy spoke in measured sentences, Margaret spoke in paragraphs. Where Dorothy's home was spare and functional, Margaret's was cluttered with the things she'd bought on installment plans, a new television console, a second set of dishes she'd seen advertised in a Sunday circular, a portable record player the children never used. Margaret was not foolish. She was simply a woman of her time, swept up in the growing current of a culture that was telling her, louder and louder every year, that buying things was the same as building something. That morning she held the catalog over the fence with both hands. "Dorothy, look at this. They've got a brand new automatic dryer on sale. 20% off through Saturday. We're going to get one." Dorothy looked at the page. A gleaming white appliance, a smiling woman in an immaculate outfit standing beside it. "How?" Dorothy asked. $12 a month, Margaret said, as if that answered everything. Dorothy nodded slowly. She didn't lecture. She never did. But in her mind, she was already doing the arithmetic. 12 months, $12, that's $144 for a machine that costs maybe $85 in cash. And that was before whatever interest the store was charging, which was never printed in the bold type. "Your sheets dry nice on the line," Dorothy said instead. Margaret laughed. "In July, sure, not in February." It was a fair point. Dorothy conceded it with a smile. She wasn't here to judge Margaret. She was here to live her own life according to her own principles. And one of those principles, bone deep since childhood, was this: if you can't hold it in your hand, you don't own it. The installment plan culture of the early 1960s was seductive, and Dorothy understood why. It dressed up debt in the language of convenience. It made the unaffordable feel reasonable. It whispered that waiting was for people without options. Dorothy saw it differently. Waiting was for people with patience, and patience, she had long understood, was a form of power. She finished hanging the last sheet and watched it catch the breeze. Clean, dry, paid for. Dorothy did not go to the store the way most people went to the store. She went the way a navigator plots a course, with the destination already fixed, the route already mapped, and no intention of drifting. Her list was not written the morning she shopped. It was written the night before, at the table, after she'd inventoried what was already in the pantry. She knew exactly how much flour was in the canister, approximately how many meals it would yield, and what the gap was between that number and the end of the week. She bought to the gap, never beyond it. That Tuesday, ground beef was 39 cents a pound at Dawson's Market. She bought 1½ pounds, not because that was the sale limit, but because that was precisely what she needed for the meatloaf on Thursday and the pasta sauce she'd make with the leftover ½ pound on Saturday. She had a use for every ounce before she set it in her bag. The woman behind her in line had 4 pounds. Dorothy didn't think less of her. She simply recognized a different relationship with uncertainty. Buying more than needed because more felt like safety, not realizing that the real safety was in knowing exactly what you needed in the first place. She moved to produce. She chose the cabbage over the lettuce, More servings per cent, sturdier, lasted longer in the cold box. She squeezed the bread until she found the freshest loaf. She weighed the carrots by hand before selecting the bunch, making sure she wasn't paying for tops she'd trim away. The butcher, a heavyset man named Harold who'd known Dorothy for 3 years, called out from behind the glass counter, "Mrs. Aldrich, got some nice soup bones in the back. 10 cents for a good-sized bag." She walked over. "Are they meaty?" "Enough," he said. "I'll take 2 bags." For 20 cents, she had the foundation of 2 pots of soup, enough to anchor 4 dinners if she stretched it right with vegetables and barley. Harold knew she'd take them because he'd seen her make the calculation before, right there at the counter, in the space of about 3 seconds. Dorothy walked out of Dawson's Market that morning with a full cloth bag and exactly the amount of change she had expected to have left over. Not approximately, exactly. The furnace had been making that sound for 3 days. Earl stood up from his chair and listened. The grinding came again, a reluctant mechanical protest from somewhere below the floorboards. He looked at Dorothy with the expression men wear when they're trying to estimate a number they're afraid of. "I'll call Hendricks tomorrow," he said. Dorothy said nothing, but her jaw was already working through it. A furnace repair in October. Worse timing. Hendricks would charge more for the urgency, and it was already the 3rd week of the month. The household account had enough for groceries and the electric bill and very little else. Unless... She excused herself, walked to the pantry, and stood in front of the bread box for a moment. Behind it, the envelope. She pulled it out and counted, not because she didn't know the number, but because seeing it made the decision real. $67. More than enough. She put the envelope back, returned to the living room, and sat down in her chair across from Earl. He was still staring at the floor, listening for the furnace. "Call Hendricks in the morning," she said. "Tell him we need him by Friday." Earl looked over. "Dorothy, I don't know if we've got—" "We do," she said simply. Not dramatically, not with a flourish. The way you might say, "The door's unlocked," as if it were just a fact of the house. He studied her for a moment. He'd seen that expression before, the particular calm she wore when she already knew something he was still catching up to. After 8 years of marriage, he'd learned not to ask her to explain it. He'd learned to trust it. "All right," he said. Hendricks came on Friday. $41 for a cracked heat exchanger seal. Dorothy paid him in cash from the envelope, thanked him at the door, and watched him drive away down the street. Then she went back inside, sat at the table, opened her ledger, and wrote down the number. 67 minus 41. $26 remaining. She would rebuild it by spring. There was a word Dorothy's mother had used her entire life, a word that had gone somewhat out of fashion by the time the 1960s got underway. Make do. It wasn't a resigned phrase. It wasn't a defeated one. In the women of her mother's generation, it carried a kind of quiet pride, the satisfaction of a problem solved without spending money you didn't have, of turning what was already there into what you needed next. Dorothy had inherited that skill like a second language. That Saturday, she was at the sewing machine turning a worn flannel shirt of Earl's into 2 pairs of pajama bottoms for the children. The shirt was beyond repair at the collar and cuffs, but the body of it was still sound. Warm, soft flannel, exactly what 2 children needed for the coming cold months. Cost? Nothing. Clara watched with the mildly curious attention of a 5-year-old who doesn't yet know there's anything unusual about what she's seeing. To her, this was simply what mothers did. Dorothy guided the fabric under the needle with steady hands. She didn't talk while she worked. She focused, the way someone focuses when they're doing something that requires more precision than people give it credit for. But part of her mind was already 2 steps ahead, planning the hem, thinking about whether she had enough of the matching thread or whether she'd need to use the dark gray, considering whether the waistband would need elastic or whether she could drawstring it. Every decision connected to another. That was the discipline, not just the act of making, but the thinking required to make it work. Margaret had called that week to mention she'd bought her daughter a new winter coat from Prange's department store. $17. A beautiful coat, she said. Dorothy had pictured it. New buttons, a little belt at the back, the kind of coat that showed other mothers you were keeping up. Clara's coat from last year still fit. Dorothy had let out the hem in October, an inch and a half, bought them another season. $17, unspent, redirected. She finished the first pair of pajama bottoms and held them up. Clara reached for them immediately. "Can I wear them tonight?" "After they're washed," Dorothy said. Clara accepted this with the ease of a child who has never been told no for any reason she couldn't understand. That was the thing about living carefully. The children didn't experience it as deprivation. They experienced it as simply how life was. And how life was in Dorothy's house was enough. The conversation started the way most dangerous conversations do, innocently, between acquaintances, about something that seemed small. A woman named Phyllis, her husband sold insurance, was talking about a new finance company that had opened on Merchant Street. She'd heard they were offering personal loans at favorable rates. A friend of hers had borrowed $300 to redo her front room. New curtains, a new sofa, a little side table she'd always wanted. "Isn't that something?" Phyllis said. $300. The other women murmured appreciatively. $300 was real money. Dorothy listened. She didn't say anything yet, but her mind was already pulling at the thread of it. Favorable rates, personal loan, $300, asking the questions nobody in the conversation was asking. What were the terms? How long to repay? What did favorable mean exactly in the language of a finance company that needed to make a profit to stay open? "She said the payments are very manageable," Phyllis continued. Manageable, that word again. Dorothy had heard it used before in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. Manageable meant the payments didn't break you, not that the total cost was reasonable. It meant you could survive the monthly figure. It didn't say anything about whether you'd end up paying $400 for a $300 loan. She thought about what her mother would have said. She thought about the particular clarity of someone who'd been through genuinely hard times, who understood at a cellular level that debt was not a tool, it was a weight, and the longer you carried it, the heavier it became. "Dorothy, would you ever?" Margaret asked, catching her expression. Dorothy considered how to answer. She had no interest in making Phyllis feel foolish or Margaret feel judged. These were her friends, her community. "My mother used to say," she offered carefully, "that the best time to borrow money is when you don't need it, and if you don't need it, you probably shouldn't borrow it." A moment of quiet settled over the group. Then Phyllis laughed, a little uneasily. "Well, that's very sensible, Dorothy." "My mother was a very sensible woman," Dorothy said, and let it rest there. She had started the ledger on the 14th of March, 1954. 8 years and 9 months ago. It wasn't a purchased accounting book, it was a simple composition notebook, the black and white marbled kind that cost 15 cents at the 5 and dime, with the pages ruled by hand when the original lines ran out. She'd filled 4 of them over the years, each one stored in a shoebox on the high shelf in the bedroom closet. The current one was 3/4 full. Every week, without exception, Dorothy sat at that table and wrote down every cent that had come in and every cent that had gone out. Not in categories, though she kept those too, but as a running narrative of the household's financial life. The furnace repair was in there, so was the week in July when Clara had an ear infection and the doctor visit cost $7. So was the $2 raise Earl had gotten in August, noted with a small asterisk. She wrote in a small, even hand. There was no emotion in the ledger itself, No exclamation marks when the reserve hit a new high, no distressed underlining when a week ran tight. It was a document, not a diary, precise, unapologetic, clear. But the act of keeping it was deeply emotional, in a way she couldn't have easily explained to anyone who hadn't done it. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing your numbers. Not from having plenty, from knowing, from having faced the arithmetic straight on, without flinching, and built your decisions on top of it. The ledger didn't tell Dorothy she was safe. It told her exactly how safe she was, which is a different and much more useful thing. She turned to that evening's page and worked through the week. Groceries, the children's school supplies, a small repair to the back porch step that Earl had managed himself with materials from the hardware store for $2 and some change. She totaled the column, checked it, totaled it again. Under budget by $3.14. $3.14 went to the envelope. She closed the ledger, returned it to the drawer beneath the dish towels, and finished her cold tea. Tomorrow, she would do it all again. January had a particular cruelty about it in years when money was already organized down to the penny. The radiologist's bill was for $22, a follow-up from a chest X-ray Earl had gotten in September after a persistent cough the doctor wanted to rule out. They'd paid the doctor directly, but the radiologist billed separately, and the billing had apparently gone to the wrong address and been forwarded twice before finally landing in the Aldrich mailbox. $22, due within 30 days. Dorothy looked at the bill that morning in the way you look at something that demands to be dealt with, not with dread, not with anger, but with the quiet activation of problem-solving instinct. She ran through the accounts in her mind. The reserve currently sat at $26, rebuilt since the furnace, slowly over 2 months. If she paid the bill from the reserve, she'd have $4 left. Not comfortable, but manageable in the real sense. She could rebuild from $4. The alternative was a payment plan through the radiologist's office, which she knew from experience meant paperwork and interest and the low-grade anxiety of an outstanding obligation sitting in a drawer. She disliked outstanding obligations the way some people dislike messes on a countertop, not catastrophically, but persistently. She paid the bill that afternoon, cash, in person, at the radiologist's office on Elmwood. The receptionist seemed mildly surprised. "You'd like to pay the full balance today?" "Yes," Dorothy said. She received a receipt and a mild compliment from the receptionist about how nice it was when people just came in and settled things. Dorothy thanked her and walked out into the January cold. The reserve was down to $4. That evening, she sat with the ledger and calculated how many weeks it would take to rebuild it to $40, the floor she'd set years ago as the minimum acceptable cushion. 6 weeks if nothing unexpected happened, 8 if something minor did. She wasn't distressed. She'd been here before. The arithmetic was clear, the path was visible, and she'd walked it before without losing her footing. She picked up her pencil and started planning March. Clara had asked. That was the part Dorothy had always hoped for, not the teaching itself, but the asking. Because you can't give someone a philosophy, you can only live one, visibly enough that eventually someone leans across a table and says, "How?" Clara was 14, and she'd just received her first real earnings, 3 weeks of babysitting for the Hendersons down the street. $7.50 in a small white envelope. She held it like it was something breakable. "What should I do with it?" she asked. Dorothy looked at her daughter, this girl who had grown up in a house where there was always enough, where the heat was always on, where the pantry was never empty, and where she had never in 14 years heard her parents argue about money. She had never known consciously that this was not an accident. Dorothy reached over and slid the composition notebook across the table. "Write it down first," she said. Clara opened the notebook and wrote, "July 14, 1971, $7.50. Dorothy watched her. "Now, before you decide what to do with it, before you spend 1 cent of it, you're going to divide it, not in your head, on the page." Clara looked up. "Into what?" And so Dorothy explained, not with jargon, not with the language of banks or financial planners or the advice columns in women's magazines that were increasingly full of words like portfolio and investment vehicle. She explained it the way her own mother had explained it to her, with a pencil and a piece of paper and the quiet authority of someone who had tested these ideas against real life for 2 decades and found them sound. Set aside what you must pay. Set aside what you might need. Spend only what remains. That was the whole of it. That was the philosophy in 3 lines. Clara wrote it down. Dorothy Aldrich never called herself a financial woman. She never wrote a column or gave advice or held herself up as any kind of example. She lived on a single delivery driver's salary for 27 years, raised 2 children, kept a house, and never once carried a debt she hadn't resolved within the month it appeared. She never said they were struggling. She also never said they were secure. She didn't think in those terms the way people in later generations would, always calculating their security relative to some imagined standard, some picture from a television commercial or a neighbor's driveway. She thought in terms of what is coming, what do I have, what is the gap, and what do I do next. That was the whole plan. It wasn't complicated, it wasn't sophisticated. It was, in the most literal sense of the word, discipline, the practice of doing the same careful, clear-eyed thing week after week until it became less a choice than a character. The consumer culture of the 1960s and beyond would try, with enormous energy and creativity, to convince American families that they needed more convenience, more comfort, more of everything, available now, payable later. Some families listened. Some spent the next decade quietly drowning in the gap between what they'd bought and what they could actually afford. Dorothy looked at that culture the way she looked at Margaret's catalog, with mild interest and complete immunity. She'd already done the math, and the math always told the same truth. The envelope behind the bread box, the pencil in the ledger, and the discipline to use them, that was the only safety net that ever actually held.